Good evening, and welcome back to SleepWise. Tonight, we drift into one of the strangest and quietest puzzles in the modern world. It is a puzzle hidden inside something most people would consider a blessing. Imagine a country waking one morning to learn that beneath its soil lies a treasure beyond easy counting. Vast oceans of oil, mountains of copper, veins of gold threaded through ancient rock, diamonds resting in old riverbeds. By every reasonable expectation, such a discovery should mean lifted lives, gentler futures, stronger schools, calmer streets, and the slow easing of hardship. Wealth, after all, is meant to help. And yet, across the past century, economists, historians, and travelers have noticed something unsettling. Again and again, countries blessed with extraordinary natural riches have struggled in ways their neighbors did not. They have grown more slowly than poorer nations next door. They have built fewer roads, weaker schools, less reliable institutions. Their currencies have wobbled. Their politics have grown brittle. Some have descended into conflict. A few have collapsed altogether, despite sitting atop reserves worth hundreds of billions of dollars. The pattern was so persistent that scholars began giving it a name. They called it the paradox of plenty. Later, more bluntly, the resource curse. Tonight, we will move slowly through this idea. We will trace its mechanisms gently without rushing. We will visit a country that lived through one of its most painful versions. And then we will travel to two very different places that received the same kind of gift and chose, in their own way, to make it a blessing rather than a wound. There is no need to memorize the figures we encounter, no need to keep up with every twist. The names, the dates, the policies, they are anchors of curiosity, not assignments to be remembered. Let your breath settle a little. Let the day begin to loosen from your shoulders, like a coat slowly slipping from the back of a chair. For there is something quietly compelling about this story. It is not really about oil or copper or diamonds. It is about what happens to a society when sudden wealth arrives without preparation. About the small daily habits that hold a country together and how easily they can be undone by something as simple as a windfall. If these quiet journeys help you rest, you can follow SleepWise and share it with someone who might enjoy drifting off while learning something new. And tonight, before we visit any country or examine any policy, there is one question worth holding close. A question that has puzzled economists for nearly 50 years, and one that still does not have a single, simple answer. Why is it that the richest ground so often yields the poorest nations? The term resource curse entered the language of economics in 1993, when a British scholar named Richard Otte used it to describe a pattern he had been studying for years. Otte had noticed that mineral-rich developing countries were performing worse than their resource-poor neighbors, often by surprisingly wide margins. The name was new, but the observation was older. As far back as the 1600s, thinkers had remarked on Spain's strange fate. how the silver flowing in from the Americas had not made Spain stronger, but had quietly drained its workshops and left it poorer than smaller neighbors. A few years after Audie's book, two American economists, Jeffrey Sachs and Andrew Warner, studied nearly 100 countries over several decades and found that nations whose exports leaned heavily on natural resources grew more slowly than those whose economies were more diversified. The relationship was not destiny, but it was strong enough to demand explanation. The data was, in its quiet way, startling. By the late 20th century, some of the most resource-rich nations on Earth had per capita incomes below those of countries with almost no natural endowments at all. South Korea, Taiwan, Singapore, and Japan, none blessed with significant oil or minerals, had built some of the most prosperous societies in human history. Meanwhile, Venezuela, sitting atop the largest proven oil reserves on the planet, had seen its economy contract again and again. Nigeria, with vast oil wealth, struggled to keep its cities lit. The Democratic Republic of the Congo, holding rich deposits of cobalt and copper, remained one of the poorest places on Earth. There were exceptions. Norway, Botswana, the United Arab Emirates, and a few others had turned natural wealth into broad prosperity. But these were the minority. The general pattern leaned the other way. The puzzle deepened when researchers looked at history. The countries that had industrialized earliest, Britain, Germany, the United States, had built their wealth largely on manufacturing, trade, and innovation. Natural resources had been one ingredient among many, not the centerpiece of the economy. So the question sharpened. It was not that natural resources caused harm directly. Oil does not corrode a country the way salt corrodes iron. Something else was happening, some invisible mechanism, or perhaps several working together, that seemed to convert blessing into burden. How did a gift become a wound? To begin understanding, we must turn from the broad pattern to the quiet machinery beneath it, starting with a phenomenon named, curiously, after a small country in northern Europe that experienced it firsthand. But before we go there, consider this. Of the 50 most resource-rich nations measured at the start of the 21st century, the majority were poorer, more unstable, or more unequal than the global average. What had gone so quietly, so persistently, wrong? In 1959, in a quiet stretch of farmland near the village of Slochteren in the northern Netherlands, engineers discovered something unexpected. Beneath the soil lay one of the largest natural gas fields ever found in Europe. The Groningen field held trillions of cubic feet of gas. Almost overnight, the Netherlands became a major energy exporter. By every visible measure, the country had been gifted a windfall. And yet, in the years that followed, something puzzling happened. Dutch manufacturing, long a backbone of the economy, began to decline. Factories struggled, exports of finished goods slipped against international competitors. Unemployment in manufacturing rose even as gas revenues climbed. Economists traced the source. As foreign buyers paid for Dutch gas, they had to acquire Dutch currency to do so. That demand pushed the value of the guilder upward. A stronger guilder meant that everything else the Netherlands sold abroad became more expensive for foreign buyers. A Dutch-made machine that had been competitive in Germany now cost more than its rivals. Orders slowed. Workshops shrank. The country's industrial base began to hollow out, not because anything was wrong with Dutch factories, but because the currency had been lifted by the gravity of gas. The phenomenon was given a name by The Economist magazine in 1977. They called it Dutch disease. A booming resource sector can quietly damage the rest of the economy by raising the currency's value and pulling labor and capital toward extraction. This is the first mechanism of the resource curse. A country discovers oil or copper or gas, and the wealth that pours in begins to undercut the industries that might have provided steady jobs for generations. But there is a second mechanism layered atop the first. It has to do with the prices themselves. Oil prices, like most commodity prices, do not move gently. They swing. They climb steeply during years of global demand and crash without warning when supply outruns appetite. In the 1970s, oil prices quadrupled in months. In the mid-1980s, they collapsed by more than half. In 2008, they reached nearly $150 a barrel before plunging below $40 within months. In 2020, oil futures briefly traded below zero. For a country whose budget depends on oil revenue, these swings are not abstractions. They are the difference between building hospitals and closing them, between hiring teachers and dismissing them, between calm streets and unrest. And so, the second mechanism reveals itself, quietly but firmly. Resource-rich economies live at the mercy of prices they cannot control, set by markets they cannot see. But even Dutch disease and price volatility, taken together, do not fully explain why some nations escape and others fall. There is a deeper force at work, one that touches not the economy, but the very foundations of the state itself. In most countries, governments are funded by their citizens. People earn wages, sell goods, run businesses, and pay taxes on what they make. The money that flows into the treasury comes, in a sense, from the daily labor of the population. And because citizens pay for the state, they tend to ask things of it. They want roads where their children walk. They want schools that work. They want courts they can trust. The relationship between the taxed and the taxing is one of the oldest and quietly most important arrangements in human history. Now imagine a different arrangement. A country discovers vast oil reserves beneath its territory. The government signs contracts with foreign companies or builds a national oil firm of its own, and revenue begins to flow directly into the treasury from the ground itself. The state no longer depends on its citizens for its income. It depends on geology and on global markets. The old conversation between taxpayer and government grows quieter. This is the third mechanism of the resource curse, and many economists consider it the most consequential. It is sometimes called the rentier effect. A rentier state is one that earns its keep not from production, but from rent, the income derived from owning a resource and letting others extract it. When such rents become large enough, the entire shape of governance begins to shift. The first effect is on accountability. When citizens do not fund the state has less reason to answer to them. Tax collection requires negotiation, record keeping, and public trust. Resource revenue requires only contracts and pipelines. Governments funded by oil can, if they choose, ignore the demands of ordinary people for years at a time. The second effect is on institutions. Strong institutions, independent courts, free media, professional civil services, honest auditors are expensive and slow to build. They emerge over decades, often through difficult struggles between rulers and citizens. In countries where the state lives on resource rents, the pressure to build such institutions weakens. The third effect is on corruption. Vast pools of resource revenue create vast opportunities for theft, kickbacks, and patronage. A minister who oversees oil contracts may control more money in a single signature than most citizens will see in a lifetime. The temptation is enormous, and the safeguards are often the very institutions that resource wealth has quietly eroded. Studies have found that resource-rich countries, on average, score lower on measures of governance, transparency, and rule of law than countries of similar income that lack such resources. The pattern is not absolute, but it is consistent enough to suggest that the wealth itself is shaping the politics around it. And once politics is shaped this way, the resource curse becomes harder to escape. The wealth meant to lift the country has begun instead to lift the few who control it. The word rentier comes from the French. In the 18th and 19th centuries, a rentier was someone who lived off the income of land or property without needing to work. They were often modest figures, retired teachers or small landlords who had arranged their lives around a quiet, dependable flow of rent. The word implied a life shaped not by daily effort, but by the steady arrival of someone else's payments. When scholars of political economy borrowed the term in the 1970s, they applied it to entire nations. A rentier state, they argued, is one whose government does not produce its income, but receives it. Oil, gas, mineral royalties, or sometimes foreign aid, flow into the treasury without the country having to build factories, train workers, or develop competitive industries. The state becomes, in effect, a landlord on a national scale. The scholar most closely associated with the idea was Hossein Mahdavi, an Iranian economist, who in 1970 wrote a study of Iran's oil-driven economy. Mahdavi noticed that the structure of Iranian government had shifted in subtle ways once oil revenue dominated the budget. Spending decisions were made without much consultation. Public services expanded in some places and stagnated in others, according to political loyalty rather than economic logic. In the decades that followed, Scholars extended the analysis to other oil-rich states across the Middle East, Africa, and Latin America. The pattern was not identical everywhere, but certain features kept recurring. Taxes on citizens were often low or non-existent, which sounded like a gift, but came with a hidden cost. Without taxes, there was no broad civic conversation about how revenue should be spent. Public sector employment grew as a way of distributing oil wealth. Subsidies on fuel and food made daily life cheaper, yet also distorted markets. There is something almost gentle in how this happens. No single official decides one morning to weaken the bond between citizen and state. The change unfolds slowly, in budget meetings and personnel decisions, in the quiet expansion of one ministry and the quiet neglect of another. Over time, the architecture of governance leans toward the wellhead rather than toward the workshop or schoolhouse. And the strangest thing about a rentier arrangement is that it can feel, for a while, like prosperity. Salaries arrive, roads get built, new airports rise from the desert. The visible signs of wealth are real, but beneath them, the deeper machinery of society may be quietly stalling. By now, we have walked through three mechanisms of the resource curse. Dutch disease, which lifts the currency and hollows out manufacturing. Price volatility, which makes budgets hostage to global swings. And the rentier effect, which loosens the bond between governments and the people they govern. To see how they can act together, we turn now to a country that lived through all three in vivid, painful detail. Venezuela sits on the northern shoulder of South America, where the Andes Mountains slope down toward the Caribbean Sea. Its geography is varied and beautiful. Jungle in the south, savanna in the middle, mountains in the west, and a long coastline. For most of its history, after independence from Spain in 1821, it was a poor agricultural country. Coffee, cacao, and cattle were its main exports. Power rotated among regional strongmen, and the economy depended on the rhythms of harvests and the prices set in distant European markets. Then, in the early 20th century, the ground itself began to change the country's story. Geologists had long suspected that oil lay beneath the basin of Lake Maracaibo in the country's northwest, a shallow inland sea ringed by villages of fishermen and farmers. In 1914, a well drilled near the lake's eastern shore struck oil in commercial quantities. The transformation that followed was extraordinarily fast. In 1922, a well called Barroso II blew out, spewing oil into the air for 9 days before it could be contained. The image traveled across the world and brought a wave of foreign companies into Venezuela. Within a decade, the country had become one of the largest oil exporters on earth, second only to the United States in production by the late 1920s. The man who ruled Venezuela during these formative years was Juan Vicente Gómez, a long-serving authoritarian who governed from 1908 until his death in 1935. Gómez offered foreign oil companies extraordinarily generous terms. Taxes were low, regulations were minimal, and the laws governing the industry were written, in part, by representatives of the companies themselves. Oil revenue flowed into the treasury, but Gomez used much of it to pay off the country's foreign debt, enrich his family, and build an army loyal to his rule. For ordinary Venezuelans, the early oil years brought a peculiar mixture of change and stagnation. Around Lake Maracaibo, new towns sprang up almost overnight, filled with foreign engineers, drillers, and the Venezuelan workers who served them. Wages in the oil zones were higher than anywhere else in the country, drawing people from the countryside. But outside the oil zones, agriculture declined. Workers left the fields for the wells. The currency, the bolivar, strengthened as oil exports grew, making imported food cheaper than domestically grown food. Within a few decades, a country that had once fed itself was importing much of what it ate. The pattern would have been familiar to any student of Dutch disease, although the term did not yet exist. Venezuela was becoming a country with a single dominant export, and the rest of its productive economy was quietly shrinking in the shadow of one gleaming product. And yet, on the surface, the country was getting richer. Roads were paved, new buildings rose in Caracas. The oil had begun its long work. After Gomez died in 1935, Venezuela began a long, uneven process of trying to claim more of its own oil wealth. A series of governments gradually rewrote the laws governing foreign companies. In 1943, a new hydrocarbons law required that the government and the oil companies share profits roughly equally, a principle Venezuelans called 50-50. It was one of the most progressive arrangements between an oil-producing country and the international firms that drilled there. The 50-50 principle would later spread across the world, influencing oil agreements from the Persian Gulf to Indonesia. Venezuela had become a model for how a developing country might assert itself against the powerful firms that had once written its laws. In 1945, a brief democratic opening brought to power a reform government led by Romulo Betancourt. It expanded public spending and tried to use oil revenue to build a broader economy. But the experiment was short-lived. In 1948, a military coup ended the democratic period, and a decade of authoritarian rule followed under Marcos Pérez Jiménez, who used oil money to build highways and showcase projects in Caracas, while suppressing opposition. When democracy returned in 1958, Venezuela entered its longest period of stable civilian government. Two main political parties alternated peacefully in power for decades. The country was considered one of the most stable democracies in Latin America. A pivotal moment came in 1960, when Venezuela's oil minister, Juan Pablo Pérez Alfonso, helped found the Organization of the Petroleum Exporting Countries, known as OPEC. Together with representatives from Saudi Arabia, Iran, Iraq, and Kuwait, he argued that producing countries needed to coordinate to prevent international companies from playing them against one another. OPEC would become one of the most influential cartels in modern history. Perez Alfonso himself was a thoughtful and curiously skeptical figure. Even as he helped build OPEC, he warned his countrymen that oil was not really a blessing. He called it the devil's excrement and predicted that an excess of oil wealth would corrupt institutions and leave Venezuela worse off than it might have been without it. Few listened at the time. The 1970s seemed to vindicate the cartel's strategy. After the 1973 Arab-Israeli War, oil prices quadrupled and Venezuela's revenues exploded. In 1976, the government nationalized the oil industry, creating a state-owned company called Petróleos de Venezuela, or PDVSA. For a while, PDVSA was considered one of the best-run national oil companies in the world. The country felt rich. Imports surged. Consumer goods filled the shelves. Public spending expanded dramatically. Caracas became a glittering city of new towers and busy restaurants. The future seemed to belong to those who owned the wells. The boom did not last. By the mid-1980s, oil prices had crashed, and Venezuela's economy contracted. The peaceful democracy that had once seemed so stable began to fray. Public debt rose, inflation climbed, inequality became increasingly visible. The political class, dependent on oil revenue, struggled to adjust. By the early 1990s, ordinary Venezuelans had grown disillusioned with the parties that had governed for decades. Into this disillusionment stepped a former army officer named Hugo Chavez. In 1992, he led a failed military coup against the elected government. The coup collapsed within hours, and he was jailed. Before being taken into custody, he was permitted to make a brief televised statement urging his fellow conspirators to surrender. In that short address, he became a national figure. His blunt style resonated with millions who felt forgotten by the country's elite. Pardoned in 1994, Chavez turned to electoral politics. He campaigned as an outsider, promising to dismantle a corrupt system and use the country's oil wealth for the poor. In 1998, he was elected president, taking office the following year. He remained in power until his death in 2013. The Chavez era coincided with one of the longest oil booms in modern history. Between 1999 and 2014, oil prices rose from around $10 a barrel to well over $100. Venezuela's revenues swelled. Chavez used them to fund ambitious social programs called missions, which expanded health care, literacy, and food subsidies in poor neighborhoods. Many Venezuelans who had felt invisible began to see the state take an interest in their lives. Yet, beneath the visible spending, the deeper structures of the economy were weakening. Chavez restaffed PDVSA, the national oil company, replacing experienced engineers with political loyalists after a strike in 2002. Production began a slow decline. Investment and maintenance shrank. The currency was kept artificially strong through controls that made import cheap and domestic industry uncompetitive. Price controls discouraged local agriculture, The country imported more and produced less, while oil masked the imbalance. Chavez also weakened the institutions that might have provided checks on his policies. Courts were packed. Media outlets faced harassment or closure. State spending was directed through opaque funds outside normal oversight. Each move had a political logic, but together they hollowed out the institutional architecture any country needs when its primary revenue is as volatile as oil. For a while, the model appeared to work. Poverty rates fell. Literacy improved. Chavez was celebrated by some abroad as a champion of the poor. But the entire edifice rested on one assumption no government can guarantee. It rested on the assumption that oil prices would stay high forever. When Chavez died of cancer in 2013, his chosen successor, Nicolas Maduro, narrowly won an election to take his place. The political project continued, but the economic foundation beneath it was already cracking. Oil production, once nearly 3.5 million barrels a day, was drifting downward. PDVSA was carrying enormous debts. Then, in 2014, the global price of oil collapsed. What had been a barrel of crude worth more than $100 in mid-2014 fell to under $50 by early 2015 and below $30 within another year. For a country whose budget depended almost entirely on oil exports, the effect was catastrophic. Roughly 95% of Venezuela's export earnings came from petroleum. When the price fell, the country's lifeline frayed. The government's response deepened the crisis. Rather than cutting spending or adjusting the currency, Maduro's administration printed money to cover the shortfall. The bolivar lost value at an alarming rate. Inflation accelerated into hyperinflation. By 2018, the International Monetary Fund estimated that Venezuela's annual inflation had passed 1 million%. Wages became worthless almost as soon as they were paid. Imports collapsed because the country had spent decades importing nearly everything: food, medicine, spare parts. The shortages were immediate and severe. Supermarket shelves emptied. Pharmacies ran out of basic drugs. Hospitals lost the ability to perform routine procedures. People lined up for hours for bread, cooking oil, soap. Many families began losing weight. A study in 2017 reported that the average Venezuelan had lost roughly 20 pounds in a year, a figure so grim it acquired its own name, the Maduro diet. Power outages spread. The electricity grid, dependent on hydroelectric plants and imported equipment no longer being maintained, began to fail in waves. Caracas, the gleaming capital of the boom years, sat in darkness for days at a time. Water pressure dropped. In some neighborhoods, residents collected drinking water from broken pipes or polluted streams. As conditions worsened, Venezuelans began leaving in numbers not seen in the region's modern history. By the early 2020s, more than 7 million people had left, walking across borders into Colombia, Brazil, Peru, Ecuador, and beyond. It became one of the largest displacement crises in the world, comparable in scale to the flight from Syria. The country that held the largest proven oil reserves on Earth had, within a few short years, become one of the most distressed states in the Americas. The collapse was not caused by oil alone. Policy choices and political decisions all played their roles. But the underlying vulnerability, the country's decades-old dependence on a single commodity, was the foundation on which everything else had been built. When that foundation cracked, much of the structure came down with it. It is worth pausing here for a moment before moving on. Venezuela's story is not simply a tale of bad leaders or bad luck. Though both played their parts, it is, more deeply, an illustration of how the three mechanisms we traced earlier in this story can work together, slowly, over generations, to undo a country that once seemed full of promise. Dutch disease arrived first in the early decades of the 20th century. As oil flowed and the bolivar strengthened, Venezuelan agriculture and manufacturing thinned. The country grew more dependent on imports for food and finished goods, and less able to produce them at home. By the time anyone gave the phenomenon a name, the damage had already settled into the structure of the economy. Price volatility followed close behind. Every oil boom in Venezuelan history was followed by a price crash, and every crash exposed how thin the rest of the economy had become. The 70s brought riches and overconfidence. The 80s brought collapse and debt. The 2000s brought another surge of revenue, and then in 2014, another fall. Each cycle drained more than money. It drained the country's ability to plan, to save, to imagine a future not tied to a single price. The rentier effect bound everything together. Because oil revenue flowed directly to the state, governments could spend without taxing, distribute without producing, and reward loyalty without much accountability. Institutions that might have steadied the country, an independent judiciary, a professional civil service, a transparent budget process, were never fully built, and over time were actively dismantled. When the test came, the structures that might have absorbed it were too weak to hold. None of this means oil was the only cause. Leaders made choices. So did opposition figures, international actors, and ordinary citizens. Venezuela's tragedy belongs to many hands, but the resource curse describes a kind of gravity, a steady pull that bends a country in certain directions unless something strong enough resists it. And that brings us to the most interesting question of all. If the curse exists, what does resistance look like? What does a country actually do to receive the same gift of natural wealth and not be undone by it? To find out, we now travel to a place very different from Venezuela. Different in climate, in culture, in size, in history, a country of long winters, deep fjords, and small coastal towns. A place that, until quite recently in its history, was one of the poorer corners of Europe, surviving on fishing, timber, and a stubborn maritime tradition. We travel to Norway, and we begin the story not in a glittering capital, but on a cold gray sea, where in 1969 On a winter evening just before Christmas, a discovery would change the country forever. For most of its modern history, Norway was a country that had to work hard for what it had. Carved out of mountains and fjords along Europe's northwestern edge, it spent centuries under the rule of Denmark, then Sweden, before achieving full independence in 1905. Its population was small, its arable land limited, and its climate demanding. Norwegians lived from the sea more than from the soil, and from timber more than from manufacturing. As late as the 1960s, it was one of the less prosperous countries in Western Europe. In the late 1950s, geologists began to wonder whether the floor of the North Sea, the shallow body of water between Norway, Britain, Denmark, and the Netherlands, might hold oil and gas. The Dutch discovery at Groningen in 1959 had encouraged the question. But the seabed off Norway's coast was deeper, stormier, and far harder to reach. Many experts doubted that significant hydrocarbons would be found in commercial quantities. The Norwegian government, cautious by nature, took its time. In 1963, it formally declared sovereignty over the continental shelf in the parts of the North Sea adjacent to Norway. In 1965, it began awarding exploration licenses to foreign oil companies, but on carefully negotiated terms that preserved the state's right to participate in future discoveries. There was no rush, no fevered grant of concessions. The first wells came up dry, so did the second, and the third. Year after year, exploration continued without success. By the late 1960s, some foreign companies had begun to lose interest. Then, on the evening of December 23, 1969, an American firm called Phillips Petroleum was preparing to wind down its operations on a drilling rig in the Norwegian sector. The well codenamed Ekofisk had not been a priority, but the engineers decided to drill one final test before packing up. What they found surprised everyone. Ekofisk turned out to be one of the largest oil and gas fields in the North Sea. Beneath the cold gray water lay reserves of staggering size. Within months, the news had transformed Norway's prospects. A poor coastal country on the edge of Europe had, almost by accident, become a major energy producer. And here, in how Norway responded, lies one of the most important lessons of the resource curse. Other countries had received similar news and rushed to spend, to borrow, to expand. Norway did something different. It paused. Almost from the moment of the discovery, Norwegian politicians, civil servants, and economists began asking questions that other oil-rich states had not always thought to ask. What if the boom did not last? What if the discovery damaged the rest of the economy? What if future generations should also benefit from this gift, not just the present one? These were not abstract questions. They became the foundation of policy. Norway's approach to its new oil wealth did not arrive in a single brilliant flash. It took shape over decades through debates in Parliament, papers from economists, and the steady accumulation of habit. But certain principles emerged early and held firm. The first principle was that the oil belonged to the Norwegian people, not just to those alive at the moment of discovery. As one early parliamentary report put it, the petroleum on the continental shelf was a common heritage. The state created a national oil company, Statoil, in 1972, to ensure that Norwegians themselves held a central role in developing the resource. Foreign firms could participate, but on terms set by the state. The second principle was that oil revenue should not flow directly into ordinary government spending. This was in some ways the most counterintuitive choice. A poor country had suddenly discovered enormous wealth. The temptation to spend it on better roads, more generous benefits, and immediate improvements in daily life was real and politically powerful. But Norwegian leaders had studied the experiences of other oil-rich nations. Countries that spent their windfalls quickly tended to overheat their economies, weaken their currencies in the wrong ways, and find themselves stranded when prices fell. The mechanism it built was, at the time, unusual. In 1990, Parliament established what would eventually be called the Government Pension Fund Global, though it had little to do with pensions in the ordinary sense. It was a savings account for the nation, designed to hold the surplus revenue from oil and gas. The fund would invest that revenue in financial markets outside Norway, in stocks, bonds, and real estate around the world. By keeping the money abroad, the fund avoided pumping foreign currency into the domestic economy, which would have strengthened the krone and damaged Norwegian industry. For years, the fund grew slowly. Oil prices were modest in the 1990s, and Norway was still building the infrastructure for its offshore industry. But by the 2000s, as prices rose and production matured, contributions became substantial. By the 2020s, the Government Pension Fund Global had become the largest sovereign wealth fund in the world, holding assets worth more than $1 trillion. Spread across thousands of companies in dozens of countries, it owned, on average, more than 1% of every publicly traded company on Earth. For a country of just over 5 million people, this was an extraordinary store of collective wealth. It was, in effect, a buffer the size of an ocean. If oil prices fell tomorrow, Norway would not collapse. The fund would continue to generate returns, and those returns could be drawn on modestly and carefully to support public spending. But a savings account alone was not enough. The discipline to leave the savings alone year after year required a rule. A savings account, no matter how vast, is only useful if its owners can keep their hands off it. Many countries have created sovereign wealth funds over the years. Not all have managed to leave them undisturbed. Politicians facing elections, recessions, or sudden popular demands have often dipped into such funds more deeply than was wise, treating long-term savings as a cushion for short-term troubles. Norway tried to guard against this temptation by binding itself in advance. In 2001, the Parliament adopted a formal fiscal rule for the use of oil revenue. The rule is elegantly simple in its core idea. In any given year, the government may spend from the fund an amount equal to the expected real return on its investments, not the underlying oil revenue itself. Originally, that figure was set at 4%, later adjusted downward to 3%. The reasoning was patient. If the fund grew in real terms by about 3% a year, then spending 3% each year would draw on returns without depleting the savings. The principle would remain intact, available to future generations. Norway, in other words, would live off the interest on its oil wealth, not the wealth itself. The petroleum beneath the seabed was finite, but the financial fund could last indefinitely. This was not just an accounting convention, it became a binding political commitment, defended across party lines and through multiple changes of government. Even during difficult years, when other countries might have leaned more heavily on their reserves, Norway largely held to the rule. The temporary deviations during the global financial crisis of 2008 and again during the pandemic were modest and carefully bounded. Just as importantly, the institutional environment around the fund was designed for transparency. Norway publishes detailed reports on its oil revenues, the fund's investments, and its governance. The Norges Bank Investment Management Division, which runs the fund, has been studied as a model of disclosure. There are debates about ethical investment policies, about whether the fund should hold shares in arms manufacturers, fossil fuel firms, or companies linked to human rights violations. These debates are public. That public quality is not incidental. The Norwegian state had, long before oil arrived, built habits of transparency, trust, and rule of law that other resource-rich countries had not. Citizens paid taxes, officials were accountable, courts were independent, media were free. When oil revenue began to flow, these institutions did not have to be invented from scratch. They simply absorbed a new responsibility into structures that already knew how to hold one another to account. This is one of the quieter lessons of the resource curse. The fund is famous, the fiscal rule is admired. But beneath both lies something older and harder to copy. A political culture that had already learned how to be honest about money. The fund and the fiscal rule are the most famous parts of Norway's story, but they are not the whole of it. Around them, Norway has built a wider set of habits that together explain why oil enriched the country rather than undoing it. One habit is investment in the rest of the economy. Even as oil revenues grew, Norway kept building industries that had nothing to do with petroleum. The country remained a global leader in shipping, in fish farming, in hydroelectric power. Its companies, in aluminum, fertilizer, and renewable energy, continued to compete on world markets. Successive governments resisted the temptation to let the rest of the economy wither in the shadow of oil. Another habit is the careful management of currency. By placing oil revenue into a foreign fund rather than spending it at home, Norway avoided much of the Dutch disease pressure that had damaged the Netherlands decades earlier. The krone did strengthen during the oil years, but not catastrophically. Norwegian manufacturers continued to find buyers abroad, even as their compatriots in the energy sector grew prosperous on the rigs of the North Sea. A third habit is generational thinking. Norwegian policy documents, parliamentary speeches, and public debates often invoke the obligation to those who will come after. The fund itself is framed not as wealth for the present, but as a trust held on behalf of the unborn. This kind of language can sound abstract, but it appears repeatedly enough in Norwegian public life to suggest something deeper than rhetoric. It is, in its way, a national commitment to the long view. A fourth habit is moderation in consumption. For a country with such a vast sovereign fund, Norway is, in many respects, modest. Public services are generous, but not extravagant. Taxes remain among the highest in Europe. Houses are comfortable, but not enormous. Inequality exists, but the country has avoided the kind of conspicuous extravagance, the glittering capitals, the empty mega projects that have marked some other oil states. Quiet wealth, distributed broadly, has been the Norwegian pattern. It is worth noting that Norway is not perfect. Its model has critics. Some argue the country has been too cautious, hoarding wealth that might have been spent on faster improvements at home. Others note that Norway has remained a major oil and gas producer even as it has positioned itself as a climate-conscious nation, an arrangement that raises difficult ethical questions in a warming world. The fund has had to navigate its own controversies around ethical investing and political influence. Yet, for all that, the result is hard to deny. Norway today is among the wealthiest, healthiest, and most stable societies on Earth. It has lived through the same oil price swings that wrecked other economies and emerged each time intact. It is, in a quiet way, what a country looks like when it does not surrender to the gravity of the curse. From the cold seas of the North Sea, our journey now turns to a very different shore. The southeastern edge of the Arabian Peninsula, where the Persian Gulf meets the open ocean, is a landscape of low sand, salt flats, mangrove inlets, and shallow turquoise water. Today, this coastline is lined with gleaming towers, 8-lane highways, and one of the busiest airports in the world. But to understand what the United Arab Emirates has become, it helps to remember what it was, not so very long ago. For centuries, the small sheikdoms scattered along this coast lived from the sea. The Gulf's warm, shallow waters were home to oyster beds that produced some of the finest natural pearls in the world. Each summer, fleets of wooden boats called dhows would sail out from villages along the coast, carrying divers who would descend without breathing equipment to gather oysters from depths of 10 or 20 meters, sometimes more. The work was dangerous and exhausting. Divers wore nose clips made of bone or wood and weighted ropes to help them sink. A boy might begin diving in his early teens and continue for decades, his body marked by injuries, infections, and the lasting effects of the deep. The pearls fed a global trade. By the early 20th century, the Gulf provided much of the world's natural pearl supply, and the coastal towns of what would later become the Emirates. Places like Abu Dhabi, Dubai, Sharjah, and Ras Al Khaimah depended on the trade. It was a hard living, but a steady one. Merchant families grew rich. Communities organized themselves around the diving season. Then, in the late 1920s, the trade collapsed. Two events undid it almost at once. The Great Depression dried up demand for luxury goods around the world. And in Japan, a businessman named Kokichi Mikimoto perfected a technique for producing cultured pearls. Pearls grown intentionally inside oysters in controlled farms. The cultured pearls were nearly indistinguishable from natural ones and could be produced at a fraction of the cost. The bottom fell out of the natural pearl market within a few years. The consequences along the Trucial Coast, as the British then called it, were severe. Diving fleets sat idle. Merchant fortunes evaporated. Coastal towns emptied as families moved inland in search of work. In the 1930s and 40s, the region became, by some measures, one of the poorest places on earth. Most people lived in palm-frond houses, drank from shared wells, and depended on date palms, modest fishing, and pearl economy savings that were rapidly running out. This was the world into which oil would soon arrive, a world of small emirates, mostly nomadic and coastal populations, no formal nation, and very little infrastructure. The future that the world now associates with the Emirates was not yet imaginable. It had to be built almost from nothing on the bones of a fallen industry. And the first step toward that future was political. Oil was first found beneath the Gulf in 1932 in nearby Bahrain. Over the next decades, exploration moved gradually along the Arabian coast. Geologists suspected that the sheikdoms along the Trucial Coast might also hold petroleum, but early surveys produced little. It was not until 1958 that a major discovery was made offshore from Abu Dhabi at a field called Shaif. Commercial exports began in 1962. Almost overnight, Abu Dhabi found itself in possession of vast oil reserves. The ruler at the time was Sheikh Shakhbut bin Sultan Al Nahyan. He was famously cautious about the new wealth. He had seen, in his lifetime, the pearl trade rise and fall. He distrusted sudden riches. Sheikh Shakhbut kept much of the early oil revenue locked away, sometimes literally, in a chest beneath his bed. Rather than spending it on roads, schools, or hospitals. To him, oil money was unfamiliar and dangerous. But the population of Abu Dhabi was changing. People were beginning to expect more. They saw the wealth and wondered why their lives remained so plain. By the mid-1960s, the country's elite, with British encouragement, decided a different leadership was needed. In 1966, Sheikh Shakhbut was peacefully replaced by his younger brother, Sheikh Zayed bin Sultan Al Nahyan. Sheikh Zayed would shape the history of the Emirates more deeply than any other single figure. He had governed the inland oasis town of Al Ain for many years, and he had a clear sense of what oil revenue could do. if used carefully. Almost immediately, he began investing in roads, water systems, schools, and hospitals. He distributed land. He built housing. The transformation of Abu Dhabi from a small coastal town into a modern city began in earnest under his rule. Sheikh Zayed also turned his attention outward. The 7 small sheikdoms along the coast, Abu Dhabi, Dubai, Sharjah, Ajman, al-Quwain, Fujairah, and Ras al-Khaimah, had long been linked by trade, kinship, and dependence on Britain for defense. As Britain prepared to withdraw from the Gulf at the end of 1971, Sheikh Zayed worked patiently with the other rulers to bring most of them into a single federation. On December 2, 1971, 6 emirates formed the United Arab Emirates. Ras Al Khaimah joined the following year. Sheikh Zayed became the first president of the new country, a position he would hold until his death in 2004. The federation was an unusual arrangement, a union of monarchies with shared institutions but considerable local autonomy. Each emirate kept its own ruler, its own laws, and its own resources. Abu Dhabi, with the most oil, would carry the heaviest share of national spending. The others would chart their own paths. For Dubai, with only modest oil reserves, this meant finding a very different strategy. Dubai had been ruled since 1958 by Sheikh Rashid bin Saeed Al Maktoum. Sheikh Rashid was a different kind of leader, where Sheikh Zayed presided over enormous oil reserves and the responsibility of a national budget. Sheikh Rashid governed a smaller emirate with far less oil beneath it. Dubai's first commercial petroleum exports began in 1969, modest compared with Abu Dhabi's. Sheikh Rashid understood, perhaps earlier than anyone else along the coast, that his emirate's oil would not last. He is often quoted as saying, "My grandfather rode a camel, my father rode a camel, I drive a Mercedes, my son drives a Land Rover, my grandson will drive a Land Rover, but my great-grandson will ride a camel." The line captured a clear-eyed view of resource impermanence. To prepare for that future, Sheikh Rashid spent his oil revenue and significant borrowed money on infrastructure that would outlast the wells. The first great project was the dredging of Dubai Creek, the saltwater inlet around which the original town had grown. Through the 1950s and 60s, the creek had been silting up, threatening the Dow trade that connected Dubai with India, Iran, and East Africa. Sheikh Rashid commissioned engineers to deepen the channel and turn the creek into a usable port for larger vessels. Then came Port Rashid, a modern deep-water container port opened in 1972 on land reclaimed from the Gulf. It was followed in the late 1970s by Jebel Ali, a far more ambitious project, an artificial deep-water harbor and free trade zone built on what was then empty desert south of the city. Jebel Ali became one of the largest man-made harbors in the world. The free zone allowed foreign companies to operate with full ownership, unusual in the region at the time, drawing investment from Asia, Europe, and the Middle East. Sheikh Rashid also invested in aviation. Dubai's first airport had opened in 1960 as a small airstrip. Most striking was the founding of Emirates Airline in 1985, launched with 2 leased aircraft. Emirates would grow into one of the largest long-haul carriers on Earth, with Dubai International eventually becoming the world's busiest hub for international travel. Sheikh Rashid died in 1990, and his sons continued the strategy. The next generation, particularly Sheikh Mohammed bin Rashid Al Maktoum, expanded the vision dramatically. Real estate, tourism, finance, technology, retail, and conferences became central. Dubai built artificial islands shaped like palms, the tallest building in the world, the busiest mall on Earth, and a financial district modeled on London and New York. The result was a city-state whose oil revenue had become almost incidental. By the 2020s, petroleum accounted for less than 1% of Dubai's gross domestic product. The emirate had, in effect, used modest hydrocarbons to fund an escape from hydrocarbons. While Dubai built its harbors and airports, Abu Dhabi pursued a quieter but equally consequential strategy. With its much larger oil reserves, Abu Dhabi could afford to think on longer time horizons. In 1976, only 5 years after the Federation was formed, the emirate established the Abu Dhabi Investment Authority, known by its initials, ADIA. It was one of the first sovereign wealth funds in the world, predating Norway's by more than a decade. The idea behind ADIA was simple. Oil revenue would not be spent only on present needs. A substantial portion would be invested abroad in stocks, bonds, real estate, and infrastructure across the globe. The returns would generate income long after the wells ran dry. By the 2020s, ADA was estimated to manage assets worth several $100 billion, though the exact figure remained famously opaque. Other Emirati funds followed, including Mubadala and ADQ, each directing oil wealth into global investment. Beyond sovereign wealth, the UAE built layers of diversification that other oil states had rarely attempted. Tourism became a deliberate national project. Dubai marketed itself as a destination for travelers from Europe, India, Russia, and East Asia, building luxury hotels, theme parks, and shopping districts. Abu Dhabi pursued a different angle, branding itself around culture. Opening a branch of the Louvre on Saadiyat Island in 2017, finance also grew. The Dubai International Financial Center opened in 2004, designed as a regulatory zone aligned with international standards, attracting banks, law firms, and asset managers from across the world. Abu Dhabi Global Market followed in 2015. Together, they made the UAE one of the leading financial hubs of the Middle East. Logistics tied the strategy together. Jebel Ali Port grew into one of the busiest container terminals on Earth. Emirates and Etihad Airlines connected hundreds of cities through the 2 main airports. Dubai Ports World, a state-linked operator, expanded to manage terminals on every inhabited continent. The country positioned itself as the natural intermediary between Asia, Europe, and Africa. There were also industrial investments, aluminum smelters in Abu Dhabi, petrochemicals along the coast, renewable energy projects, including the Masdar Initiative, which announced ambitious plans for solar power. None of these by themselves transformed the economy. Together, they reduced the country's exposure to any single revenue source. By the 2020s, oil and gas still mattered to the UAE, particularly in Abu Dhabi, where most of the national hydrocarbon reserves are located. But the share of the overall economy directly tied to petroleum had fallen substantially. Services, trade, tourism, finance, real estate, and aviation had taken on weights few had imagined possible in the 1970s. The country had used its oil. It had not, in the end, been used by it. It is worth pausing to ask how the UAE managed what so many other oil states did not. The country is not a democracy in the Norwegian sense. It does not publish the detailed accounts of its sovereign wealth funds the way Oslo does. It has serious critics, particularly on questions of labor rights, political openness, and the treatment of migrant workers. And yet, when measured against the mechanisms of the resource curse we traced earlier, the UAE has, by most standards, escaped them. Consider Dutch disease. The Emirati economy did not hollow out around oil. It diversified outward with deliberation. Aviation, logistics, finance, tourism, real estate, and trade now contribute the bulk of the country's economic activity. Foreign workers, who make up the majority of the population, fill roles across nearly every sector, allowing the economy to grow far beyond what a small Emirati citizen population could have sustained alone. This arrangement raises its own difficult questions, but it has worked to prevent the narrow dependence that trapped other oil states. Consider price volatility. The UAE has weathered every major oil price crash since the 1970s. The Federation has not collapsed. Public services have continued to function. Construction projects have paused at times, and budgets adjusted. But the country has never experienced the kind of collapse Venezuela suffered. The buffer of accumulated sovereign wealth combined with diversified revenue has absorbed shocks that would have shattered a less prepared economy. Consider the rentier effect. This is where the UAE story becomes most complicated. Its citizens pay no personal income tax. The state provides generous benefits, free education, subsidized housing, and well-paid public sector jobs. By classic theory, this should produce weak institutions and disengaged citizens. And yet, in practice, the Emirati state has built an unusually competent administrative apparatus. Ministries function, infrastructure works, public services are delivered. The country has invested heavily in education and in capacity building within the government itself. The UAE's solution to the rentier challenge has been to professionalize the state without democratizing it. Whether that solution is stable in the long run is a serious question, but in the time frame we have observed, it has produced one of the most efficient governments in the Middle East. There is also a cultural element. The Emirati leadership, from Sheikh Zayed onward, has spoken openly and repeatedly about life after oil. The vocabulary of post-petroleum economies is not confined to think tank reports. It appears in official speeches, school curricula, and national strategy documents. The expectation that oil will not last forever has been woven deliberately into the country's self-image. In that sense, the UAE has done something Venezuela never did. It has chosen again and again never to take its own resource for granted. The UAE's success did not unfold in isolation. The countries of the Gulf Cooperation Council, founded in 1981, share many features. Small native populations, vast hydrocarbon wealth, similar monarchic political systems, dependence on foreign workers, and proximity to the same shipping lanes. As the Emirati model demonstrated that diversification was possible, other Gulf states began to follow. Saudi Arabia, by far the largest oil producer in the region, watched its smaller neighbor with growing interest. For decades, the kingdom had relied almost entirely on petroleum revenue, producing fewer than 2% of its export earnings from anything other than oil. In 2016, under Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman, the government unveiled an ambitious plan called Vision 2030. The strategy borrowed openly from the Emirati playbook. It called for the expansion of tourism, entertainment, mining, technology, and renewable energy. It restructured the kingdom's sovereign wealth fund into one of the largest pools of investment capital in the world. Saudi Arabia is trying with urgency to escape its dependence on oil. Qatar followed a different path, oriented around natural gas. The country sits atop the North Field, the largest natural gas reservoir on Earth, shared with Iran. From the late 1990s onward, Qatar invested heavily in liquefied natural gas, becoming one of the world's leading exporters. It also built sovereign wealth funds, an international airline, a global media network in Al Jazeera, and major investments abroad. Hosting the FIFA World Cup in 2022 was both a showcase and a strategy. Bahrain, with smaller oil reserves, became one of the earliest regional financial centers, though it has struggled in recent decades with political tensions and competition from Dubai. Kuwait built one of the world's oldest sovereign wealth funds, the Kuwait Investment Authority, established in 1953, even before formal independence from Britain. Oman has pursued a steadier diversification through tourism, ports, and logistics, drawing on a long maritime tradition. None of these countries have escaped oil dependence as fully as the UAE. The economic transitions remain incomplete, and rising tensions, demographic pressures, and climate concerns add new layers of difficulty. But the broader pattern is striking. Across the Arabian Peninsula, the assumption that hydrocarbons would fund every future has given way to a more forward-looking question. What will these countries do when the oil and gas eventually fade? The UAE did not answer that question alone, but it answered it earlier and more visibly than most. And in doing so, it helped reshape the strategic horizon of the entire region. Sometimes a single small country, by the example of its choices, can change the imagination of its neighbors. If we step back now and look at Norway and the UAE together, the contrast is striking. They arrived at similar outcomes by very different paths. Norway is a small parliamentary democracy with a long tradition of consensus politics, broad social trust, and powerful public institutions. The UAE is a federation of monarchies in which most political power rests with ruling families, and where the native citizen population is dwarfed by a larger expatriate workforce. Norway is cold, mountainous, and northern. The UAE is hot, coastal, and Arab. By almost any measure of political form or cultural style, the two countries could not be more different. And yet, when they discovered enormous hydrocarbon wealth within years of each other, both did something unusual. They resisted the gravity of the resource curse. Norway resisted through restraint. It established a sovereign wealth fund, bound itself with a fiscal rule, invested its oil revenue abroad, kept its existing industries strong, and protected its institutions through transparency. The Norwegian model is one of self-binding. It worked because Norwegians broadly agreed to limit their own ability to spend. The UAE resisted through diversification. It used its oil revenue to build airports, ports, free zones, tourism, finance, and global investment platforms. It established sovereign wealth funds early. It professionalized its administrative state. It planned openly for a future beyond petroleum. The Emirati model is one of construction. It worked because Emirati leadership, broadly, agreed to invest rather than to consume. Both models share certain deeper features. Both took the long view. Both treated oil revenue as a temporary opportunity rather than a permanent entitlement. Both invested heavily in human capital, in education, in skills, in capacity. Both built institutions, whether democratic or technocratic, that could carry weight beyond a single ruler or election. Both avoided the temptation to spend every windfall the moment it arrived. There are also serious differences worth naming honestly. Norway's wealth is more evenly distributed among its citizens. The UAE's wealth, while broadly available to its citizens, depends on a foreign workforce whose treatment has drawn international concern. Norway publishes detailed accounts of its fund. Emirati funds are more opaque. Norway's political system invites accountability through elections. The UAE's through long-term planning and elite consensus. Neither model is without flaws, and neither is the perfect prescription for any other country. But both stand in their own ways as proof that the resource curse is not destiny. Two countries with almost nothing in common found their own answers to the same question. And the answers, however different in form, shared one essential trait. Each treated its sudden wealth as a responsibility rather than a reward. That, more than any single fund or policy, may be the deepest lesson of all. We began with a question that seemed almost paradoxical. Why does the gift of natural wealth so often wound the countries that receive it? Why does the richest ground so often yield the poorest nations? We followed that question through the slow machinery of Dutch disease, through the swings of commodity prices, through the strange erosion that comes when a state lives off the wellhead rather than off its citizens. We watched these forces work, together and apart, on one country in particular, where extraordinary oil reserves coincided with one of the steepest declines of the modern era. And then we traveled to two very different places, far from one another in almost every way, and watched what countries do when they refuse to let the gift become a wound. We saw Norway pause before spending, build a vast fund, bind itself with a fiscal rule, and treat its wealth as a trust for future generations. We saw the UAE, under Sheikh Zayed and his successors, use its oil revenue to construct airports, ports, sovereign wealth funds, and a diversified economy, planning openly for the day when the wells would no longer matter. We saw the rest of the Gulf, watching the Emirati example, begin to chart paths of its own. What unites these stories is not a single policy. It is a posture, a way of holding wealth carefully rather than gripping it tightly, a willingness to see oil as something temporary, not as something permanent, a patience to invest in habits and institutions that will outlast any single well. The resource curse we have learned tonight is not a verdict. It is a tendency, a gravity, a pull on the structure of a country that bends it in certain directions unless something stronger resists. The countries that succumb are not cursed by nature. The countries that escape are not blessed beyond ordinary merit. The difference lies in what each country does year after year with the gift it has been given. Outside the room, somewhere across the world, oil is still rising from beneath the seabed. Cargo ships are crossing the Strait of Hormuz. Sovereign wealth funds are quietly buying shares in distant companies. A pump jack is turning under a desert moon. And in some country we have not yet imagined, geologists are about to find something that will change everything. What that country does next will depend more than anything on what it has already become. For tonight, you do not need to solve any of it. You do not need to remember the figures. You do not need to keep track of the names. Let the names drift away like soft lights. Let the question settle. The world will continue its turning. The wells will continue their pumping, and the cities of glass and the towns of palm fronds will continue their long, patient negotiation with the future. The world slows, and so do we. Good night.